The mountain town of Cedar Ridge sat like a weathered crown jewel in the Colorado Territory, its main street carved from the stubborn earth where silver veins had once promised fortunes. Now in 1887, only one fortune remained, and it belonged to the Hartwell family, whose mansion loomed over the settlement like a constant reminder of who held power in this remote corner of the world. Ezra Blackwood moved through the early morning shadows with the fluid silence of a man who had spent 63 years learning the language of the wilderness. His weathered face, carved by decades of mountain wind and sun, showed no emotion as pale blue eyes the color of winter ice tracked the movements of the town's morning routines. Gray hair hung past his shoulders, and his worn buckskin coat bore the patina of countless seasons in the high country. Most folks in Cedar Ridge knew him only as the strange hermit who came to town for supplies twice a month, speaking few words and drawing little attention. If you're listening to this story from somewhere in the mountains like our setting today, or anywhere you've seen injustice go unchallenged, drop a comment and let me know what state or country you're from. Sometimes the wilderness calls to us all. The screaming started just after 8 in the morning. Marcus Hartwell emerged from the Silver Dollar Saloon where he'd spent the night drinking and gambling, his expensive suit wrinkled and his dark hair disheveled. At 26, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never faced consequences, his soft features unmarked by hardship or responsibility. Behind him trotted a beautiful Irish setter, its red coat gleaming in the morning sun despite the fear that clouded its intelligent brown eyes. The dog had committed the unforgivable sin of relieving itself on the saloon's wooden steps. Marcus yanked a leather riding crop from his belt and brought it down across the animal's back with a sharp crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The dog yelped and cowered, trying to press itself against the ground as blow after blow rained down on its flanks and head. Strike the worthless mongrel harder, Marcus thought with savage satisfaction. Father always said you have to show these beasts who's master. Ezra stopped dead in the middle of the street, his pale eyes fixing on the scene with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. His weathered hands, scarred from decades of skinning knives and steel traps, slowly curled into fists at his sides. Around the town square, other early risers hurried past with downcast eyes. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins clutched her market basket tighter and quickened her pace toward the general store. Young Billy Santos, the blacksmith's apprentice, started toward the commotion but stopped when he saw the Hartwell family crest embroidered on Marcus's vest. Even Sheriff Douglas Crane, emerging from his office with a cup of coffee, took one look at the situation and suddenly found urgent business that required his immediate attention in the opposite direction. Nobody challenged the Hartwell boy. Nobody ever had. Marcus delivered 3 more vicious strikes before stepping back to admire his handiwork. The setter lay panting in the dirt, blood seeping from welts across its back and a gash above its left eye where the crop had caught it wrong. "That'll teach you proper manners," he said to the trembling animal. "Next time you'll think twice before embarrassing me in public." His 3 companions, sons of lesser wealthy families, laughed and offered approving comments. Jonathan Pike suggested they find a cat to practice on next. Thomas Brennan wondered aloud if the dog would still be able to hunt come fall season. Ezra remained motionless across the street, but something fundamental shifted in his posture. The easy, rolling gait of an old mountain man hardened into the predatory stillness of an apex predator. Those winter-pale eyes tracked every detail. Marcus's height and weight, the expensive pocket watch chain hanging from his vest, the soft hands that had never done an honest day's work, the way he favored his left leg slightly when he walked. The dog struggled to its feet, whimpering softly, and limped toward the alley behind the mercantile. Dark spots of blood marked its path in the dust. Marcus brushed dirt from his hands and adjusted his cuffs, already dismissing the incident as he turned toward the hotel where breakfast would be waiting. His father owned the hotel along with half the businesses in town, which meant Marcus never paid for anything and never heard the word no. "I suppose we should head back to the house," he announced to his friends. "Mother's hosting a luncheon for those tedious church ladies, and I promised to make an appearance." The group moved off down Main Street, their laughter carrying on the mountain air as they discussed plans for the day. Marcus never glanced back at the blood in the dirt or bothered to check if the dog had survived his lesson. But Ezra Blackwood watched everything. He memorized the route Marcus took toward the Hartwell mansion on the hill. He noted which building shadows provided the best vantage points. He cataloged the number of windows in the big house and estimated the distance from the edge of town to the estate's front gate. Most importantly, he began calculating exactly how long it would take a man with the right skills to follow someone home without being detected. The old trapper had spent 40 years tracking everything from rabbits to grizzly bears through terrain that would kill most men. He had guided cavalry units through Apache country and taught survival skills to miners who thought they understood the wilderness until winter taught them otherwise. His hands had set snares for wolves, and his eyes had tracked wounded elk through snowstorms that lasted for days. Marcus Hartwell had just made himself prey. As the younger man disappeared around the corner toward his family's mansion, Ezra finally moved from his spot in the street. But instead of continuing toward the general store where he had planned to buy supplies, he turned and followed the blood trail the injured dog had left behind. He found the setter in the alley, licking its wounds and shivering despite the warming morning air. When Ezra approached, the dog looked up with eyes full of pain but no aggression. It had learned to expect cruelty from humans. "Easy there, partner," Ezra said softly, extending one scarred hand for the animal to smell. "Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The dog's tail gave a tentative wag. Ezra examined the wounds with practiced efficiency. Nothing that wouldn't heal, but the gash above the eye would need cleaning to prevent infection. He pulled a clean bandana from his coat pocket and used water from his canteen to gently clean the worst of the blood away. "You're going to be fine," he told the setter, whose tail wagged more confidently now. "But that boy who did this to you, well, that's a different story entirely." As he worked, Ezra's mind was already moving ahead to the evening hours when shadows would provide cover and when wealthy young men typically settled into their comfortable routines. He thought about the hunting knife secured in the sheath on his belt, its blade sharp enough to shave with and balanced perfectly for throwing. He considered the coils of rope in his cabin and the steel traps he knew how to set for much larger prey than rabbits. Marcus Hartwell had spent his morning teaching a lesson about power and cruelty. Tonight, Ezra Blackwood would begin teaching lessons of his own. The setter limped away toward the residential section of town where kinder hands might offer shelter, leaving Ezra alone in the alley with blood-stained dirt and the echo of cruel laughter still hanging in the mountain air. He stood slowly, his joints protesting after 6 decades of hard living, but his mind sharp as the hunting knife at his belt. 40 years of tracking had taught him that understanding your quarry meant following it home, learning its patterns, discovering where it felt safest. Marcus Hartwell was about to become the most important hunt of Ezra's life. The old trapper moved through Cedar Ridge with the invisible efficiency of a man who had spent decades avoiding detection by both animals and hostile tribes. He kept to the shadows between buildings, used reflections in storefront windows to track his target, and maintained the perfect distance that allowed observation without discovery. Marcus and his companions walked with the oblivious confidence of young men who had never needed to watch their backs. The Hartwell mansion sat on a carefully manicured hill overlooking the town, its 3 stories of imported brick and ornate ironwork declaring the family's dominance over this corner of Colorado territory. Ezra positioned himself behind a cluster of pine trees at the property's edge and watched Marcus dismiss his friends at the front gate before strolling up the circular drive with the casual arrogance of inherited wealth. From his concealed vantage point, Ezra began cataloging details that would matter later. The mansion had 17 windows facing the town, each one a potential entry or exit point. 2 servants moved through the lower floors, their routine movements suggesting they followed predictable schedules. The stable behind the main house held 4 horses, and a carriage path led around to a rear entrance used for deliveries. Most importantly, Marcus's bedroom occupied the corner of the 2nd floor where 2 large windows offered access from the massive oak tree that grew within climbing distance of the house. The wealthy always think walls can protect them from consequences, Ezra thought as he memorized the layout. They never consider that a man who's tracked grizzlies through blizzards might find their defenses somewhat less challenging than mountain wilderness. By late afternoon, Marcus emerged from the mansion dressed in fresh clothes and riding boots, apparently refreshed from whatever luxuries had occupied his day. Ezra followed at a distance as the young man headed back toward town, noting how Marcus walked with the swagger of someone who had never faced genuine opposition. The killing happened near Widow Patterson's cottage. A mourning dove, its wing clearly broken from some earlier mishap, struggled in the dirt beside the road, unable to take flight but desperately trying to escape as footsteps approached. Marcus spotted the injured bird, and his face lit up with the same cruel pleasure Ezra had witnessed that morning during the dog beating. "Well now, what have we here?" Marcus said to nobody in particular. "Looks like something's having a bad day." He raised his expensive leather boot and brought it down hard on the dove's head, grinding it into the earth with deliberate force. The small body convulsed once and went still, its gray feathers now stained with blood and dirt. Marcus examined the sole of his boot with mild annoyance, as if the bird's death had been an inconvenience rather than a deliberate act of cruelty. He scraped the bottom against a nearby fence post to remove the blood and tissue, then continued toward town whistling a popular tune. Behind him, Ezra knelt beside the crushed dove and felt something cold and implacable settle into his chest, like winter moving into the high country. The bird had been no threat to anyone, posed no challenge, offered no profit or purpose beyond existing in a world that had already wounded it. Marcus had killed it simply because he could, because inflicting pain brought him satisfaction. "Some creatures deserve protecting," Ezra whispered to the small corpse, his voice carrying the weight of decisions made. "And some need to learn there are consequences for their actions." He buried the dove beneath a cluster of wildflowers growing beside the widow's fence, using his hands to dig the shallow grave while his mind traveled back 30 years to a conversation with his mentor, an old Cheyenne tracker named Stone Bear, who had taught him that hunting carried responsibilities most white men never understood. "Every death has meaning, young wolf," Stone Bear had told him during a bitter winter when they tracked wounded elk through the high peaks. "You take life to feed your people, to protect them from danger, to maintain the balance. But you never kill for pleasure, never cause suffering without purpose. The moment you do, you become something else entirely." Marcus Hartwell had become something else entirely. Ezra made his way through the gathering dusk toward his cabin, a modest structure built into the mountainside 3 miles from town where he had lived alone since returning from his final government contract 15 years earlier. The single room contained everything a man needed: a stone fireplace, a simple bed, shelves lined with preserved food, and a workbench where he maintained his tools. Those tools commanded respect throughout the territory, though few people knew their history or the man who wielded them. The hunting knife with its 10-inch blade had been forged by a master craftsman in Kansas City and had never failed to find its target when thrown. The rifle mounted above the fireplace was a custom Sharps .4570 that could drop an elk at 400 yards. Coils of rope, steel traps, and snares filled a wooden chest, each item maintained in perfect working condition. But tonight Ezra focused on the collection of smaller blades arranged on the workbench like surgical instruments. Skinning knives, throwing knives, a slender stiletto designed for silence rather than power. He selected each one with careful consideration, testing edges against his thumb and checking balance points with the practiced efficiency of a master craftsman evaluating his tools. 43 years ago, he had been Ezra Blackwood, teenage runaway fleeing an abusive father in Ohio. 38 years ago, the Army had trained him as a scout and tracker for cavalry units operating in hostile territory. 26 years ago, he had earned his reputation hunting the massive grizzly bear that had killed 7 people across 3 counties, tracking it through terrain that defeated teams of professional hunters. 15 years ago, after his final contract ended badly in Apache country, he had retired to this mountain sanctuary, hoping to find peace in solitude and distance from violence. Today, Marcus Hartwell had reminded him that peace was a luxury some people didn't deserve to enjoy. Ezra cleaned and sharpened each blade while darkness settled over the mountains, his hands moving with automatic precision while his mind calculated distances, timing, and approach routes. The mansion's oak tree would support his weight easily. The servants retired by 10 o'clock each night. Marcus typically stayed out until midnight drinking and gambling before returning home through the rear entrance to avoid waking his parents. Tomorrow night, Ezra decided, he would begin teaching Marcus about fear. The psychological phase had to come first. Every successful hunt started with understanding your prey's behavior patterns, then gradually altering those patterns through carefully applied pressure. A tracking wolf would shadow a deer for days, appearing at the edge of vision just long enough to create anxiety before vanishing again. The constant threat of unseen danger would eventually exhaust the prey's defenses and create opportunities for the final strike. Marcus would learn what it felt like to be hunted. Ezra spent the next morning in town, purchasing supplies and observing Marcus's daily routine with the methodical patience of a professional tracker. The young man emerged from the mansion at 9:30, visited the barber shop for a shave and trim, spent an hour at the bank handling family business, then settled into the Silver Dollar Saloon for an extended afternoon of drinking and cards. During each stop, Ezra positioned himself where Marcus might catch glimpses of him without quite registering his presence. A weathered figure reflected in the barbershop mirror, a shadow moving past the bank's front window, a familiar silhouette visible through the saloon's batwing doors. By evening, Marcus was glancing over his shoulder more frequently and checking the shadows with nervous energy he couldn't quite explain. "Something's wrong," he confided to Jonathan Pike as they shared a bottle of expensive whiskey. "I keep feeling like someone's watching me, but every time I look there's nothing there." Jonathan laughed and suggested Marcus was suffering from guilt over the morning's incident with the dog, but the joke didn't seem to ease Marcus's growing unease. "You're imagining things," Thomas Brennan added. Who in this godforsaken town would have the backbone to follow a Hartwell around? None of them noticed the pale blue eyes watching from the darkness beyond the saloon's lamplight, or the weathered hands that could throw a knife with deadly accuracy from twice that distance. Marcus left the saloon just after midnight, walking home alone as his friends headed to their own residences. The mountain air carried a chill that made him pull his coat tighter as he hurried along the empty streets, glancing frequently at the shadows between buildings. Halfway to the mansion, he stopped abruptly and called out to the darkness. "I know someone's there," he said, his voice carrying a tremor he couldn't quite suppress. "Show yourself if you've got business with me." Only silence answered from the pine trees lining the road. Marcus waited another minute, then continued toward home with quicker steps and more frequent backward glances. Behind him, Ezra melted from shadow to shadow like smoke, close enough to count the young man's heartbeats but invisible as winter wind. The hunt had officially begun. 3 days of psychological pressure had transformed Marcus Hartwell from an arrogant bully into a young man who checked corners and jumped at sudden noises. The constant feeling of being watched had settled into his bones like mountain cold, making him irritable and prone to outbursts that his friends attributed to too much whiskey and too little sleep. On the 4th evening, Ezra decided it was time for a more direct approach. The Silver Dollar Saloon buzzed with its usual collection of miners, ranch hands, and townspeople seeking refuge from another hard day in the territory. Marcus sat at his customary corner table with Jonathan and Thomas, but his eyes constantly darted toward the entrance, and his hand remained close to the derringer he'd taken to carrying since the paranoia started. The batwing doors swung open with a soft creak, and Ezra stepped into the smoky interior with the quiet confidence of a man entering familiar territory. Every conversation in the saloon gradually died as patrons registered the presence of the mountain hermit who rarely ventured into their social spaces. Ezra moved through the crowd like water flowing around stones, his pale blue eyes fixed on Marcus with predatory intensity. The younger man's face went white as he recognized the weathered figure from his peripheral nightmares of the past few days. "Evening, son," Ezra said as he reached Marcus's table, his voice carrying the gravelly undertone of a man who had spent decades breathing thin mountain air. "Might I have a word?" Marcus recovered some of his composure and gestured dismissively at the empty chair across from him, though his hand remained near his weapon. "You're the old lunatic who's been following me around town," he said with forced bravado. "Take a seat if you want, but make it quick. I don't have time for whatever nonsense you're peddling." Ezra settled into the chair with fluid economy of movement, his hands resting calmly on the table where Marcus could see them. The contrast between the two men was striking. Marcus soft and pampered despite his 26 years. Ezra lean and weathered like ancient leather, but radiating the coiled potential of a loaded spring. "I've been watching you, boy," Ezra said without preamble. watching how you treat things that can't fight back, animals that never did you harm. Marcus laughed with genuine amusement, his confidence returning as he realized this confrontation was happening in public where his family's influence would protect him. You're lecturing me about animals, old man. What are you, some kind of crazy animal lover living up in the woods talking to squirrels and deer? Jonathan and Thomas joined their friends' laughter, but Ezra's expression remained unchanged, his pale eyes never leaving Marcus's face. I'm suggesting you might want to reconsider your methods. Ezra continued in the same level tone. Creatures deserve better than what you've been giving them. The laughter around the table grew louder and more mocking. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never faced consequences for his actions. And what exactly are you going to do about it, you crazy hermit? Report me to Sheriff Crane. Send a strongly worded letter to my father. Maybe sick a pack of woodland creatures on me like something out of a fairy tale. Behind the bar, old Henrik Mueller stopped polishing glasses and looked more closely at the mountain man sitting with the Hartwell boy. Something about the weathered face and pale blue eyes triggered a memory that made his German-accented voice catch in his throat. Wait just 1 minute, Henrik said, his voice cutting through the laughter. You said your name was Blackwood. Ezra turned his attention to the bartender and nodded once. That's right, Ezra Blackwood. The effect on Henrik was immediate and dramatic. The glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor behind the bar, sending whiskey and fragments across the wooden planks. His face went pale as winter snow. Mein God, Henrik whispered, then spoke louder to the man sitting at the bar nearest him. You hear that name, Carl? That's Blackwood. The Blackwood. Carl Patterson, whose brother had died in the grisly attacks 26 years earlier, straightened on his bar stool and stared at Ezra with sudden recognition and respect. The bear hunter, Carl said quietly. You're the one who tracked down old Satan himself. A hush fell over the saloon as the significance of that name began to register with the older patrons. Even men who had been children during the Grizzlies' reign of terror knew the stories that had become legend throughout Colorado territory. Marcus looked confused and slightly annoyed that attention had shifted away from his confrontation with the strange mountain man. What are you all babbling about? He demanded. Bear hunter. What bear? Henrik wiped his hands on his apron and approached the table with something approaching reverence in his manner. Young Hartwell, he said, his accent thick with emotion, you are sitting across from the man who saved this entire region from the devil himself. 26 years ago, a massive grizzly bear killed 7 people across 3 counties. Professional hunters, army scouts, bounty hunters, they all tried to track that monster. All failed or died trying. The saloon had gone completely silent now, with every man present listening to Henrik's recounting of events that had shaped the territory's history. The bear was 12 feet tall when it stood up, Henrik continued. Weighed over 800 pounds. Claws like railroad spikes. The newspapers called it Old Satan because it seemed to appear from nowhere, kill whatever it wanted, then vanish back into the wilderness like smoke. Marcus glanced at Ezra, who sat motionless and expressionless, neither confirming nor denying the story. So what? Marcus said, though his voice carried less conviction than before. Some old bear got killed decades ago. What does that have to do with anything? Carl Patterson turned on his barstool to face the table directly. Your father was just a boy when it happened, Marcus, but I remember every detail. That grizzly killed my brother Thomas when he was checking traps up near Copper Creek. Ripped him apart so bad we could barely identify the pieces. The bartender nodded grimly and continued the story. The territorial governor posted a $5,000 bounty, dead or alive. Every hunter from Denver to Santa Fe came trying to claim that money. The bear killed 3 more of them before winter set in. People stopped traveling alone. Children couldn't play outside. We lived in terror for 8 months. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his earlier confidence beginning to erode as he sensed the genuine respect and fear in the older men's voices. Then in spring, Henrik said, this quiet young man shows up in town. Maybe 30 years old, carries a big Sharps rifle and asks simple questions about the bear's territory and habits. Nobody thinks much of him at first. Just another bounty hunter heading off to die in the mountains. Ezra spoke for the first time since the recognition began, his voice soft but carrying clearly in the silent saloon. Took me 6 weeks to find his den, he said matter-of-factly. Another 2 weeks to learn his hunting patterns. Bear was smart. Avoided traps, never returned to kill sites, stayed downwind of human scent. The quiet admission sent a visible shiver through several of the listening men. But I was patient, Ezra continued. Followed him through country that would kill most men. Slept in trees when he was close. Ate raw meat so smoke wouldn't give away my position. Finally cornered him in a box canyon up near the timber line. How did you kill it? Carl asked quietly. Single shot through the heart at 90 yards, Ezra replied. Had to be perfect because I only had one chance before he charged. Bear dropped dead 10 feet from where I was standing. Henrik crossed himself and poured a shot of his best whiskey, pushing it across the table toward Ezra. The whole territory celebrated for a week when word got out, he said. Churches held Thanksgiving services. Governor himself came to shake your hand and present the bounty money. But you disappeared right after, Carl added. Turned down interviews with newspaper reporters, refused to have your picture taken. Most folks figured you'd spent the money and moved on to other hunting grounds. I stayed in these mountains, Ezra said simply. Built a cabin, learned to live quiet. Been here ever since. Marcus looked around the table at the faces of men who clearly viewed the weathered mountain man with something approaching awe. His usual arrogance was crumbling under the weight of a reputation he couldn't dismiss or mock. So you killed one bear 26 years ago, Marcus said, trying to regain some control of the situation. That's supposed to make me afraid of you. Ezra's pale blue eyes fixed on Marcus with the intensity of a predator measuring prey. That bear had killed 7 people and evaded dozens of professional hunters, he said in the same level tone. You've been killing helpless animals and terrorizing creatures that trust humans to protect them. Which one of us do you think required more skill to track down? The implicit threat in those words was unmistakable, and Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized this wasn't the harmless mountain hermit he'd assumed he was dealing with. You're threatening me, he said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried minutes earlier. I'm educating you, Ezra corrected. About consequences. About what happens when someone with the right skills decides your behavior needs correcting. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. You can't touch me, old man, he declared, but his hand trembled slightly as he dropped coins on the table to pay for his drinks. My family owns half this town. One word from me, and Sheriff Crane will have you locked up or run out of the territory. Ezra remained seated, his expression unchanged. Sheriff Crane was 12 years old when I brought down old Satan, he said quietly. His father pinned a medal on my chest and told him to remember what real courage looked like. You might want to ask the sheriff how he feels about men who hurt defenseless animals. The color drained completely from Marcus's face as he realized his usual protections might not apply in this situation. This isn't over, he said, backing toward the saloon doors. No, Ezra agreed, his pale eyes never leaving Marcus's face. It's not. Marcus hurried out of the saloon with Jonathan and Thomas trailing behind, their earlier laughter replaced by uncomfortable silence. Through the window, the remaining patrons watched the 3 young men cross the street with considerably less swagger than they'd possessed an hour earlier. Henrik refilled Ezra's whiskey glass without being asked. Been a long time since we've seen you in town for more than supplies, he observed. Ezra took a slow sip and gazed out the window toward the Hartwell mansion on the hill. Sometimes a man comes out of retirement, he said softly, for the right reasons. Outside in the cool mountain evening, Marcus hurried toward the safety of his family's estate while constantly checking the shadows behind him. The comfortable arrogance that had protected him his entire life had been stripped away in the span of a single conversation, leaving him face to face with the terrifying realization that there were consequences in the world he couldn't buy his way out of. For the first time in his privileged life, Marcus Hartwell understood what it meant to be prey. Marcus Hartwell spent the next 2 days barricaded inside the family mansion like a medieval lord under siege, convinced that thick walls and armed servants would protect him from the weathered mountain man whose pale blue eyes had stripped away every illusion of safety he'd ever possessed. The Hartwell estate employed 6 men for security, each one armed with rifle and sidearm, each one positioned at strategic points around the property's perimeter. None of them had ever tracked a legendary grizzly bear through terrain that killed professional hunters. On the 3rd morning after the saloon confrontation, Marcus woke to find wolf tracks pressed into the soft earth directly beneath his bedroom window, each paw print perfectly formed in the mud from the previous night's rain. The tracks circled the massive oak tree that grew within arm's reach of his second-floor room, as if some massive predator had spent hours pacing below while he slept. But there were no wolves within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge, and Marcus knew it. He summoned the head groundskeeper, an experienced frontiersman named William Cross who had worked for the Hartwell family for over a decade. Cross examined the tracks with growing unease, his weathered face grim as he traced the distinctive claw marks with one finger. "These weren't made by any wolf, Mr. Marcus," Cross said quietly. "Wrong size, wrong gait pattern. Someone with considerable skill carved these into the mud to look like wolf prints." Marcus stared down at the evidence from his bedroom window, his hands trembling as the implications sank in. "You're telling me that mountain lunatic was standing right here outside my window last night," he said, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. Cross nodded grimly. "Sir, whoever made these tracks got past 6 armed guards, climbed this tree without making a sound, and spent enough time here to create an elaborate message. Then he vanished again without anyone seeing or hearing him leave." The psychological warfare escalated throughout that day as Ezra demonstrated exactly how inadequate the mansion's defenses were against a man who had spent 40 years perfecting the art of invisible movement through hostile territory. At noon, the estate's prized hunting dogs began howling with primordial terror, refusing to leave their kennel despite the groundskeeper's attempts to calm them. The 4 hounds, bred specifically for tracking mountain game, pressed themselves against the back wall of their enclosure and whined like frightened puppies whenever anyone tried to lead them outside. "Something's got them spooked beyond reason," Cross reported to Marcus during an emergency meeting in the mansion study. "They won't eat, won't stop shaking, won't go near the perimeter fence. It's like they can smell death itself lurking in the woods." By evening, the distinctive call of a mountain lion echoed across the estate grounds despite the fact that no cougars had been seen in the region for over 5 years. The haunting scream came from different locations each time, sometimes from the stable, sometimes from the ornamental gardens, sometimes from the very tree outside Marcus's window. The servants began abandoning their posts. Maria Santos, the head cook who had worked for the family since Marcus was a child, was the first to leave. She appeared in the study with her belongings packed and her face pale with fear. "I'm sorry, Mr. Marcus," she said, her voice shaking. "But I got grandchildren to think about, and whatever's hunting you has marked this place. I can feel it in my bones." By the following morning, 3 more servants had departed during the night, slipping away with their possessions like refugees fleeing an approaching army. The stable boy left behind a hastily written note explaining that his horses refused to be saddled and kept trying to break down their stall doors to escape. Marcus's father, Cornelius Hartwell, returned from a business trip to Denver to find his estate in chaos and his son barricaded in the mansion like a prisoner in his own home. "This is ridiculous," the elder Hartwell declared after hearing Marcus's account of recent events. "You're cowering from one old mountain man who probably couldn't hurt a fly if his life depended on it. I'm calling Sheriff Crane to have this lunatic arrested and run out of the territory." But when Cornelius tried to send a telegraph message to the county authorities, he discovered that the lines had been cut sometime during the previous night. The wagon road leading away from the estate had been blocked by a massive fallen tree that would require a full crew with saws and draft horses to clear. Even the narrow horse trail that connected the property to the main road showed signs of deliberate sabotage, with sections of the path undermined to create treacherous footing for any mount. Ezra Blackwood was methodically eliminating every escape route. "We're trapped," Marcus whispered as he stared out the study window at the darkening mountain landscape. "He's got us trapped like animals in a cage." Cornelius Hartwell was not a man easily intimidated, having built his fortune through shrewd business dealings and occasional ruthless elimination of competitors. But 40 years of comfortable living had softened him, and he had never faced an opponent who possessed the patience and skill to conduct a siege like a master tactician. That night, the mountain lion calls grew closer and more frequent, circling the mansion with predatory intent that made the remaining servants huddle together in the main hall rather than retire to their individual quarters. The call seemed to come from impossible locations: the roof, the chimneys, the walls themselves. Marcus sat in the trophy room surrounded by the mounted heads of dozens of animals his family had killed over the years for sport and decoration. Elk, deer, black bears, mountain sheep, even a massive buffalo head that dominated one entire wall. The glassy eyes of dead creatures seemed to watch him with accusation as he cleaned and loaded his derringer with hands that shook despite his efforts to maintain control. At exactly midnight, the front door of the mansion opened with a soft click despite being locked and barred from the inside. Marcus heard the sound from the trophy room and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Footsteps moved through the main hall with the measured pace of someone completely confident in their ability to navigate the darkness. No floorboard creaked, no furniture scraped, but Marcus could sense the presence moving through his family's home like death itself had come calling. The footsteps stopped outside the trophy room door. "I know you're in there, boy." Ezra's voice carried through the heavy wood with the quiet authority of a man stating simple facts. "Time we had our final conversation about respect and consequences." Marcus raised his derringer with both hands. The small weapon wavering as terror made his muscles spasm uncontrollably. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking like an adolescent's. "I'm armed, and I'll shoot if you come through that door." Ezra's laughter was soft and completely without humor. "You're holding a two-shot derringer," he said matter-of-factly. "Effective range maybe 10 feet if you're lucky. I've been throwing knives accurately for 40 years from twice that distance." The door swung open slowly, revealing Ezra silhouetted against the hallway's dim lamplight. His right hand rested casually on the handle of the hunting knife at his belt, but he made no threatening moves as he stepped into the trophy room. Marcus fired both shots in rapid succession, the small-caliber bullets whining harmlessly past Ezra's head to embed themselves in the doorframe behind him. Before Marcus could even consider reloading, Ezra's hand moved with fluid precision. The hunting knife left its sheath, flipped twice through the air, and struck the derringer's barrel with enough force to tear the weapon from Marcus's grip and send it clattering across the hardwood floor. The young man found himself staring into pale blue eyes that held all the warmth of a winter grave, completely defenseless, and finally understanding that his family's wealth and influence meant absolutely nothing to the weathered predator standing before him. "Now then," Ezra said as he retrieved his knife and slid it back into its sheath. "Let's discuss your education about treating God's creatures with proper respect." Marcus pressed himself against the wall beneath the massive buffalo head, his expensive clothes soaked with sweat and his face white with terror. "What do you want from me?" he whispered. "I want you to understand something very important," Ezra replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Every animal you've hurt, every creature you've tortured or killed for your amusement, had more right to exist in this world than you do." The mounted animal heads seemed to loom larger in the flickering lamplight, their dead eyes reflecting the scene below like a jury of the victims Marcus had created throughout his privileged life. "You think because you're rich, because your family has power, because you've never faced consequences, that gives you the right to cause suffering whenever it pleases you," Ezra continued. "Tonight you learn different." Marcus tried to speak but only managed a strangled whimper as Ezra stepped closer, moving with the predatory grace that had allowed him to track and kill the most dangerous grizzly bear in Colorado territory. "I could end your miserable existence right here in this room," Ezra said quietly. "Make it look like an accident. Leave your body for your father to find in the morning. Nobody would question the death of a coward who died of fright when faced with real consequences for the first time in his worthless life." "Please," Marcus managed to whisper. "I'll do whatever you want. I'll change. I'll leave town. Just don't kill me." Ezra studied the terrified young man for a long moment, his pale eyes cataloging every detail of Marcus's complete psychological collapse. "Death would be too easy," he finally said. "Too quick. You need to live with the knowledge of what you are and what you've done. You need to carry that weight for the rest of your days." The mountain man turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at Marcus. "But understand this, boy. If I ever see or hear about you hurting another innocent creature, I'll come back. And next time, there won't be any conversation about education or consequences. There will just be justice, swift and final." Ezra disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, leaving Marcus alone in the trophy room surrounded by the glassy-eyed stares of dozens of dead animals and the crushing weight of his own cowardice. Outside, the mountain lion calls resumed their haunting chorus, but now they sounded like celebration rather than threat. The siege was over, but the real torment was just beginning. Marcus Hartwell spent the remainder of that endless night curled in the corner of the trophy room like a beaten animal, surrounded by the mounted heads of creatures that seemed to watch his suffering with silent satisfaction. Every shadow could hide death itself. Every sound might herald the return of the pale-eyed mountain man who had stripped away every illusion of safety and power that money could provide. Dawn brought no relief. Only the terrible clarity that comes when a man finally understands his true place in the natural order of things. Ezra appeared at sunrise, materializing from the morning mist like a vengeful spirit as Marcus stumbled from the mansion's front door in search of escape from the suffocating weight of his own terror. The young man's expensive clothes were wrinkled and stained with sweat, his hair disheveled, his soft features haggard from a sleepless night of confronting his own cowardice. "Going somewhere, boy?" Ezra asked quietly, his weathered face showing no emotion as he blocked the path to the stable where Marcus had hoped to saddle a horse and flee. Marcus tried to speak but only managed a broken whimper as his legs gave out beneath him, sending him to his knees on the gravel driveway like a supplicant before an avenging angel. "Please," he finally managed to whisper. "I understand now. I'll never hurt another animal. I'll leave Colorado Territory and never come back. Just let me go." Ezra studied the broken young man with those pale blue eyes that had tracked wounded grizzlies through blizzards and read the fear sign of prey animals across 40 years of professional hunting. "Leaving isn't enough," he said matter-of-factly. "Running away doesn't balance the scales for what you've done. Justice requires something more personal." From his coat, Ezra produced a length of rope and a leather collar, both items crafted with the meticulous attention to detail that marked all his hunting equipment. "You're going to learn what it feels like to be helpless," he continued as he approached the kneeling figure. "You're going to understand the terror those innocent creatures experienced when you decided their suffering was entertainment." Marcus tried to scramble backward, but found his muscles frozen by the absolute certainty in Ezra's voice. The mountain man secured the collar around Marcus's neck with practiced efficiency, then used the rope to create a leash that would allow control without causing permanent physical damage. "Stand up," Ezra commanded, his tone carrying the same calm authority he had once used to direct cavalry units through hostile territory. Marcus struggled to his feet, the leather collar tight enough around his throat to make every breath a conscious effort. The rope extended 10 feet, giving him limited movement while keeping him under complete control. "We're going to take a walk through town," Ezra announced. "You're going to experience what it means to be led around for someone else's amusement while people watch and make judgments about your worth." The next hour became the longest of Marcus's privileged life as Ezra led him down the mountain road toward Cedar Ridge like a prize animal being brought to market. The leather collar chafed against his neck with every step, and the constant tension on the rope reminded him that his freedom existed entirely at another's discretion. Word of the strange procession spread through town faster than wildfire. Miners emerging from the early shift stopped their conversations to stare. Shopkeepers stepped onto the boardwalks to witness the impossible sight of Marcus Hartwell, heir to the largest fortune in 3 counties, being led through the streets like a dog on a leash. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins, the same woman who had hurried past when Marcus beat the Irish setter 5 days earlier, stood in front of the general store with her arms crossed and an expression of grim satisfaction on her weathered face. "How does it feel to be powerless, young Hartwell?" she called out as the procession passed. "How does it feel to know your money can't protect you from consequences?" Marcus tried to respond, but the collar made speech difficult, reducing his words to strangled gasps that only emphasized his helplessness. Sheriff Douglas Crane emerged from his office as the crowd began to follow behind Ezra and his captive, the lawman's hand resting on his sidearm, but his face showing uncertainty rather than determination to intervene. "This has gone far enough, Blackwood," the sheriff called out, though his voice lacked the authority usually associated with official commands. "Turn him loose, and we'll call this matter settled." Ezra stopped in the middle of Main Street, and turned to face the sheriff with those winter-pale eyes that had intimidated more dangerous men than a small-town lawman who owed his position to political appointment rather than competence. "You remember what I told you about consequences, Sheriff?" Ezra said quietly. "This boy spent years hurting creatures that couldn't defend themselves. Now he gets to understand what that feels like." The sheriff took an involuntary step backward as he met Ezra's gaze and remembered childhood stories about the legendary bear hunter whose reputation had shaped the territory's folklore. "5 more minutes," the sheriff said, his voice considerably less certain than before. "Then you turn him loose, or I'll have to take official action." Ezra nodded once and continued leading Marcus through the growing crowd of townspeople who had gathered to witness the spectacle. Some faces showed satisfaction at seeing the arrogant rich boy finally facing consequences for his behavior. Others displayed the uncomfortable recognition that comes when people realize they had enabled cruelty through their own inaction. The procession ended at the spot behind the mercantile where Marcus had beaten the Irish setter 5 days earlier. Dried blood still stained the dirt, a dark reminder of casual cruelty delivered without thought or conscience. "Kneel down," Ezra commanded as he positioned Marcus directly over the bloodstain. The young man sank to his knees in the same dirt where the injured dog had bled, the leather collar forcing him to keep his head raised while the assembled crowd watched his humiliation. "This is where you decided an innocent animal deserved pain for your entertainment," Ezra said, his voice carrying clearly to every observer. "This is where you proved you're nothing more than a coward who needs helpless victims to feel powerful." Marcus tried to speak, but only managed choking sounds that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably as they recognized the genuine terror in his eyes. "Let this be understood by everyone here," Ezra announced, addressing the crowd rather than his captive. "Marcus Hartwell is leaving Cedar Ridge today, and he's never coming back. If he ever returns, if anyone ever sees him hurting another innocent creature anywhere in this territory, they can find me in the mountains, and I'll finish what we started here." The absolute certainty in those words sent a visible shiver through the assembled townspeople, who suddenly understood they had witnessed something far more significant than public humiliation. They had seen justice delivered by a man whose reputation for deadly competence made his promises indistinguishable from absolute truth. Ezra removed the collar and rope, freeing Marcus, but leaving him kneeling in the dirt beside the bloodstain that marked his first known act of cruelty in Cedar Ridge. "Get out of my sight," Ezra said quietly. "Pack whatever you can carry and be gone before sunset. If I see you again after dark, our next conversation will be considerably shorter." Marcus struggled to his feet and stumbled away through the crowd without looking back, his expensive clothes torn and stained, his face bearing the hollow expression of a man whose entire understanding of his place in the world had been destroyed in the span of a single week. Henrik Mueller approached Ezra as the crowd began to disperse, the old German bartender's face showing a mixture of respect and concern. "That was justice delivered," he said quietly. "But at what cost to your own soul, my friend?" Ezra's pale blue eyes fixed on the mountain peaks visible beyond the town's borders, his weathered face carrying the weight of decisions that could never be undone. "Violence always has a cost," he replied. "The question is whether that cost is worth paying to protect those who can't protect themselves." By afternoon, word had spread throughout the territory about the confrontation between the legendary bear hunter and the Hartwell heir. Cornelius Hartwell arrived from Denver in a hired carriage, his face red with rage and his voice demanding immediate action from Sheriff Crane. "I want that mountain lunatic arrested and charged with assault, kidnapping, and public humiliation of my son," the elder Hartwell thundered as he burst into the sheriff's office. "I'll see him hanged for what he's done to my family's reputation." Sheriff Crane shifted uncomfortably behind his desk, remembering both his childhood admiration for the bear hunter and his adult understanding of political realities in a town where the Hartwell family owned half the businesses. "Mr. Hartwell," the sheriff said carefully, "your son left town of his own accord this afternoon. No charges were filed, no official complaint was made. As far as the law is concerned, this is a private matter between individuals." Cornelius Hartwell's face grew even redder as he processed the sheriff's reluctance to act against Ezra Blackwood. "Are you telling me you're going to let that savage get away with humiliating my family?" he demanded. I'm telling you that Ezra Blackwood has done more for this territory than your entire family combined, Sheriff Crane replied with growing confidence. And if your son had shown proper respect for innocent animals in the first place, none of this would have happened. The elder Hartwell stormed out of the sheriff's office and spent the rest of the day attempting to rally support for action against Ezra, but found that the mountain man's reputation for deadly competence made most people reluctant to choose sides in a conflict between the Hartwells and the bear hunter. By evening, it became clear that Marcus had indeed left the territory permanently, taking only what belongings he could carry and abandoning the comfortable life that had shaped his cruel character. His departure created a vacuum in the social structure of Cedar Ridge, but it was a vacuum filled quickly by a new awareness of consequences for those who abused positions of power. Mrs. Hutchins made a point of reporting 2 incidents of animal mistreatment to Sheriff Crane within the following week. Other townspeople began intervening when they witnessed cruelty instead of looking away and hoping someone else would handle the problem. The Irish setter that Marcus had beaten was adopted by a kind family who nursed it back to full health and gave it the respectful treatment every creature deserved. Ezra returned to his mountain cabin as autumn began painting the high country in shades of gold and crimson. He spent long evenings sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind peaks that had sheltered him for 15 years of attempted peaceful retirement. The hunting knife rested in its sheath, clean and sharp, but carrying the weight of justice delivered through necessary violence. His hands, scarred by decades of survival in hostile territory, showed no tremor as they held his evening coffee, but his pale blue eyes reflected the burden that comes to any man who understands that protecting innocence sometimes requires destroying those who prey upon it. Violence was never the answer anyone wanted to find, but sometimes it was the only answer that worked. The cost was measured not in the fear of bullies who learned consequences existed, but in the soul of the man who had to teach those lessons. In the gathering darkness, mountain lions called to each other across the high valleys, their voices carrying messages of territory and survival that had echoed through these peaks for countless generations before humans arrived with their complicated concepts of justice and mercy. Ezra listened to those ancient songs and found a measure of peace in the knowledge that some things in the natural world remained unchanged despite the moral complexities that humans brought to questions of right and wrong. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight the mountains were quiet, and the innocent creatures in his care could rest safely under stars that had witnessed both cruelty and the justice that followed in its wake. 5 years had passed since Marcus Hartwell fled Cedar Ridge in disgrace, and the mountain town had transformed into something fundamentally different from the place where cruelty once went unchallenged and wealth provided immunity from consequences. The change began with small acts of courage that grew into a cultural shift affecting every aspect of community life. Sheriff Douglas Crane, now confident in his authority and respected for his willingness to stand against powerful interests, had worked with the town council to establish the first animal protection ordinances in Colorado Territory. The laws were simple but comprehensive. Deliberate cruelty to animals carried mandatory fines and possible jail time, regardless of the perpetrator's social standing or financial resources. The ordinances were known throughout the region as Blackwood's Laws, though Ezra himself had played no role in their creation beyond providing the moral example that inspired their necessity. Mrs. Eleanor Hutchins had become the unofficial guardian of animal welfare in Cedar Ridge, investigating reports of mistreatment and coordinating care for injured or abandoned creatures. Her small house behind the general store had been converted into an informal sanctuary where hurt animals could recover under the protection of a community that had learned the importance of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves. The Irish setter that Marcus had beaten on that terrible morning 5 years earlier now lived peacefully with the Hutchins family, its red coat gleaming with health and its intelligent brown eyes showing no trace of the fear that had once clouded them. The dog, now called Justice by the children who had named him, served as a living reminder of both cruelty overcome and the redemption possible when good people chose action over indifference. Old Henrik Mueller still tended bar at the Silver Dollar Saloon, but the mounted animal heads that had once decorated the walls as trophies of wealthy men's hunting expeditions had been replaced with paintings of living creatures in their natural habitats. The change reflected a broader shift in how the community viewed the relationship between humans and the wild things that shared their mountain territory. Ezra Blackwood remained a figure of legend and respect, though he visited town infrequently and always maintained the quiet dignity that had characterized his bearing since returning to the high country 15 years earlier. When he did appear on Main Street for supplies or business, conversations would quiet respectfully until he passed, not from fear, but from genuine reverence for a man whose actions had taught an entire community about courage and moral responsibility. The children of Cedar Ridge grew up hearing stories about the bear hunter who had saved their parents from a monster that killed with claws like railroad spikes, and about the man who had taught their town that protecting innocent creatures was worth any personal cost. These stories shaped their understanding of right and wrong in ways that would influence their actions throughout their adult lives. Young Timothy Santos, now 16 and working alongside his father in the blacksmith shop, had been only 11 when the confrontation with Marcus Hartwell shook the community's foundations. The lessons learned during those transformative days had molded his character in profound ways that became apparent when a drifter named Jack Morrison made the mistake of thinking Cedar Ridge was still the kind of place where casual cruelty went unpunished. Morrison arrived on a hot summer afternoon, leading a pack mule that bore obvious signs of systematic abuse. The animal's back was raw from an ill-fitting saddle, its ribs showed through dull coat, and its eyes held the defeated exhaustion of a creature that had learned to expect only pain from human contact. The drifter stopped at the Silver Dollar for whiskey and gambling, leaving his mule tied in the blazing sun without water while he disappeared inside for what became an extended afternoon of drinking and boasting about his travels through rough country. Timothy noticed the suffering animal first and approached Henrik Mueller with the quiet determination that had become characteristic of Cedar Ridge's younger generation. "Mr. Mueller," he said, "that mule outside needs water and shade. Its owner's been in your saloon for 3 hours drinking while his animal suffers in the heat." Henrik glanced through the window at the obviously distressed mule, then at the drifter who was already drunk despite the early hour. "I'll speak with him," Henrik promised. But Timothy shook his head. "No, sir," the boy replied with calm certainty. "This is what Mr. Blackwood taught us. We don't ask permission to do what's right." Within minutes, Timothy had organized a group of young people who moved the mule to shade, provided fresh water, and began treating its wounds with supplies from Mrs. Hutchins's animal sanctuary. When Jack Morrison emerged from the saloon an hour later to find his property being cared for without his permission, his reaction was predictably violent. "Get away from my animal, you interfering brats," Morrison shouted, raising his hand to strike Timothy across the face. The blow never landed because 3 adult men stepped between Morrison and the boy before his arm could complete its swing. Sheriff Crane's hand rested on his sidearm. Henrik Mueller carried a shotgun he'd retrieved from behind the bar, and William Cross, the former Hartwell groundskeeper, stood with arms crossed and an expression that promised significant consequences for anyone who threatened children under his protection. "You've got 2 choices, stranger," Sheriff Crane said in the tone of voice that had learned to carry unquestioned authority. "You can pay the fine for animal cruelty under our town ordinances, treat your mule with proper respect, and move on peacefully. Or you can spend the next month in my jail thinking about why we take these matters seriously in Cedar Ridge." Morrison looked around at the faces of townspeople who had gathered to support the sheriff and realized he was outnumbered by people who shared a common understanding about protecting innocent creatures from abuse. "This is Blackwood's law," Mrs. Hutchins announced from her position near the treated mule. "We learned it the hard way 5 years ago, and we've been teaching it ever since." The drifter paid his fine, accepted food and medical supplies for his mule, and left town that same evening with a story he would tell in saloons throughout the territory about the Colorado mountain town where children felt empowered to stand up against animal abuse and adults backed them up with the force of law and community solidarity. Word of such incidents spread beyond Cedar Ridge, attracting attention from territorial officials who were beginning to consider similar animal protection measures in other communities. A delegation from the state capitol visited during the following spring to study the ordinances and their implementation, leading to legislation that extended animal protection throughout Colorado Territory. The formal recognition came during the autumn of that same year when the territorial legislature voted to establish a memorial garden in Cedar Ridge dedicated to the innocent creatures that had suffered before the community found its moral voice. The memorial was a simple affair, a small park with native plants, a clear stream, and a bronze plaque that acknowledged both the animals that had been lost and the man whose actions had inspired lasting change. Ezra attended the dedication ceremony at the quiet insistence of Sheriff Crane and Mrs. Hutchins, though he stood at the back of the gathered crowd and spoke to no one except the children who approached him with questions about tracking and wilderness survival. After the speeches ended and most adults had returned to their daily responsibilities, Ezra found himself surrounded by a group of young people who had grown up in the community he had helped shape through his confrontation with Marcus Hartwell. Mr. Blackwood, Timothy Santos asked with the earnest curiosity that characterized his generation, "Will you teach us about proper hunting? About respecting the animals we need for food and understanding our responsibility to the land?" Ezra studied the faces of the children and saw a genuine interest in learning principles that went far beyond simple woodcraft skills. These young people had been shaped by stories about moral courage and the obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. They understood that taking life for survival required wisdom, respect, and a humility that their parents' generation had sometimes lacked. Saturday morning, Ezra said simply, "Meet me at the edge of town before sunrise. Bring water, warm clothes, and ears ready to listen." The tracking lessons that began that weekend continued throughout the years that followed, with Ezra passing on knowledge about reading sign, understanding animal behavior, and maintaining the delicate balance between human needs and respect for the wild creatures that shared their mountain territory. The children learned that hunting was never about demonstrating power over helpless prey, but about participating in the ancient cycle of life and death that required both skill and reverence. As autumn settled over the high country and the 10th anniversary of Marcus Hartwell's departure approached, Ezra stood on his cabin porch watching the sunset paint the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that never lost their ability to inspire wonder. The hunting knife at his belt remained sharp and ready, but it had not been drawn in anger since that night in the trophy room, when he had taught a cruel young man about consequences. Justice walked up the mountain path, his red coat gleaming in the fading light as he made his weekly visit to the cabin where Ezra offered food and companionship to any creature seeking refuge from the complexities of the civilized world below. The dog's presence had become a ritual that connected the hermit mountain man to the community he had helped transform, a living bridge between solitude and service. The old tracker scratched Justice behind the ears and reflected on the strange paths that had led him from legendary bear hunter to teacher of children who would grow up understanding that strength carried obligations and that protecting innocence sometimes required men to risk everything they valued. In the gathering darkness, mountain lions called across the valleys with voices that carried messages of survival and territory that had echoed through these peaks for countless generations. Their songs reminded Ezra that the natural world operated according to principles of balance and consequence that humans ignored at their peril, but could learn to respect through experience and wisdom. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to pass on hard-won knowledge to young people who had been shaped by community values rather than individual arrogance. Tonight, the mountains were peaceful, and the innocent creatures under his protection could rest safely under stars that had witnessed both cruelty and the justice that followed when good people found the courage to act. If this story of courage, consequences, and community transformation moved you the way it moved me to tell it, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more tales of ordinary people who found extraordinary strength when circumstances demanded moral courage. We bring you stories about standing up for those who can't defend themselves, about the price of justice, and about the legacy we leave through our actions. Until next time, may you find the strength to act when action is needed and the wisdom to know when that moment arrives.